All right. So today we are going to continue a look at the prophets, and today we're in Ezekiel, and I'm calling him a visual prophet. Many of them use visual aids and act things out, but he, perhaps more than any other prophet, acts things out and displays things using visual aids. Ezekiel is during this same period as Jeremiah and Daniel. During the captivity, Daniel was taken first to Babylon. Ezekiel was taken in the next group, and then Jeremiah, of course, stays in Jerusalem through the destruction of Jerusalem. But Ezekiel's going to start prophesying before Jerusalem is actually destroyed. And so in Ezekiel 1, verses 1 through 3, it says, "Now it came to pass in the 30th year, in the 4th month, on the 5th day of the month, as I was among the captives by the river Chebar, that the heavens were opened, and I saw visions of God. On the 5th day of the month, which was in the 5th year of King Jehoiakim's captivity, the word of the Lord came expressly to Ezekiel the priest, the son of Buzi, in the land of the Chaldeans, by the river Chebar, and the hand of the Lord was upon him there." All right, so Ezekiel is a priest, but of course he's been taken away. So now he cannot serve as a priest, at least not in the role at the temple, but he's going to be used in the service of God as a prophet. And when we look through the story of Ezekiel, what we find at first is this terrifying, awe-inspiring vision of God. It's rather similar to what Isaiah saw, where he sees the God on his throne. He sees these living creatures, the 4 living creatures around the throne, covered with wings that are the cherubim, and he's basically struck with this awe of how mighty and holy God is. And then God tells Ezekiel that he's sending him to the children of Israel who are rebellious and stubborn and are not going to listen to him. But he tells Ezekiel he has the responsibility of a watchman to warn the people. And as long as he warned them, he had done his job and would not be guilty of their blood. But if he did not warn them, he would be guilty. So it doesn't matter if he knew that they were not going to listen to him or figured that they would not listen to him. His job was to warn them anyway. And if he warned them, he had done his responsibility before God. And this comes up a couple of times throughout the book. And in his prophesying, God made him seem kind of like a crazy man in some ways. He was unable to speak at all except to tell the people what God said, at least at various times. We see that he was mute. He was tied up, it seems, in his house so that he couldn't go out. And there are various things that I'm not saying the people thought he was crazy. I think they understood he was a prophet. They did at a certain point, certainly, know that he was a prophet. But in some ways, it was almost, as if he was behaving in a crazy way. It's not the normal picture of a prophet who just went around and told people what God said. God was using him to get the attention of these people. And he was told to make a clay tablet with Jerusalem portrayed on it. So I don't know if that's drawn out on it or built up with clay on it, but however it was, it's a picture of Jerusalem on a clay tablet. And he was to act out a siege against the city of Jerusalem. And he had to lie on his left side for 390 days. Which represented the 390 years of sin of the house of Israel. That's what God said. And he had to lie on his right side for 40 days for the 40 years of sin of the house of Judah. Now, I'm not sure that I fully understand what the 390 years of sin or the 40 years of sin is, but I can see that that would be a horribly difficult thing to do, to lie on one side for over a year. But I'm sure God helped him, as God always helps those who do his will. But he had to bake enough bread to eat during that time, and he'd eat very little each day. He was told how much to eat each day and how much water to drink, and it was very little water for a day. And that was to demonstrate what it would be like for the Israelites during the siege of Jerusalem. He had to bake the bread over human dung. At least that's what God said at first. But then, as Ezekiel begged not to do that because it would be unclean, then God relented and let him use animal dung instead. But basically, the people who were going to be taken or going through the siege would basically be using their own dung as the fuel for the fires to bake their bread. And God also had him use a sharp sword, like a razor, to cut his hair and his beard. He had to weigh and divide the hair and use it to represent different things that would happen to the Israelites in Jerusalem regarding how they would die. So the news for those who were still in Jerusalem was not good. They were going to die from pestilence, sword, or famine. Now, that doesn't mean every single person. We know Jeremiah was there. We know that Ebed-Melech was there, and there were others that did not die, certainly, in this way. But for the majority of the people, especially those that were unfaithful to God, this is what was going to happen to them. And God gave Ezekiel this vision of idolatry being practiced in Jerusalem, even in the temple itself. So he took Ezekiel there in a vision and showed him all these different things that they were doing and practicing idolatry, even in the temple. And in the vision, God had a man go through and put a mark on the foreheads of all the men that were bothered by the wickedness done there, those that were not participating, that that did not approve of this wickedness. They were marked by God, and then 5 other men were to go throughout the city and kill everyone who did not have the mark. So these were God's people who were marked, and then everyone who did not have the mark were to be killed in this vision. And so also in this, God had Ezekiel prophesy against some specific people, by name, who were giving wicked counsel in Jerusalem. And one of them actually died while Ezekiel was prophesying. And remember, Ezekiel is far away from Jerusalem. He is, you can't get a message back and forth even in a day. It takes time to travel, quite a bit of time to travel back and forth. But because God is showing him what's going on at the time in this vision, one of these men died. And in the vision, after the vision, God told Ezekiel to act out going into captivity. So he had to dig through the wall and go out carrying his belongings. So the people are seeing this. I mean, this is a visual aid. He's demonstrating to them what is going to happen to them, or to the people who are going to come out of Jerusalem, how they're going to come into captivity. And he had them prophesy. He had Ezekiel prophesy against the false prophets. Of course, we saw a lot of that in Jeremiah. We see a good bit of it, maybe not quite as much, in the book of Ezekiel. And he said that their false prophecies strengthened the hand of the wicked, so that the wicked did not turn from their wicked ways to save their lives. And that was the big problem with these false prophets. You can see that same application can be made to false teachers today who teach people to commit sin, who approve of sin, because they do not turn from their wickedness if they're listening to these false teachers. And God had very strong things to say against these false prophets. I think we can look at the same thing about us today. We need to make sure we do not approve of sin in our teaching. And God spoke against the elders of the people because they had idols in their hearts. Now, they had been taken out of Jerusalem. They did not have their idols anymore, but he said that the idols were in their hearts. God could see their hearts. He knew what was there, and he would not be inquired of by them. Then he says something interesting in chapter 14, verses 19 and 20. He says, "Or if I send a pestilence into that land and pour out my fury on it in blood and cut off from it man and beast, even though Noah, Daniel, and Job were in it, as I live, says the Lord God, they would deliver neither son nor daughter. They would deliver only themselves by their righteousness." So, and this is after he's talked about a number of things with the same three men mentioned, but he says Noah, Daniel, and Job are essentially, the examples of righteous men. And Daniel is there at this time. This is during the time of Daniel that this is said. But it's very interesting that these three are called out as being extremely righteous. But he says even they could not save their sons or daughters through their righteousness, like Noah did in the days of the flood. He said, not anymore. Everybody who's sinning will die. Everybody who's righteous will live, and that's that. He's demonstrating how he's going to treat people spiritually, really, is what he's doing. You can't save someone spiritually through your righteousness. They have to repent themselves. But God describes Jerusalem as a girl that God had had mercy on, saved from death, took care of her, and married her. Then she committed adultery, killed the children she had borne him as sacrifices, and then she was worse than Samaria or Sodom, Samaria being the capital of the nation of Israel that had been taken away before. And while God would punish her, he also says that he would establish his covenant with her and provide atonement for all that she had done. So after all this description of how wicked she is, he says he's going to provide atonement for that. And God explains very clearly his way of dealing with righteousness and sin. That's a big part of the book of Ezekiel. The one who sins dies, and the one who's righteous lives. And if a righteous person turns to sin, he dies. If a wicked man turns to righteousness, he lives. And God does not want anyone to die. All right, we won't read this, but in these verses in chapter 21, verses 18 through 22, it just describes how the king of Babylon was using divination to decide where to go, and God was going to cause it basically he's going to go against Jerusalem and put up the siege that Ezekiel had been prophesying about. In chapter 24, verses 15 through 18, again, we're not going to read it right now because of time, but he's told that God is going to take the desire of his eyes, and he's not allowed to mourn for this loss, and it was his wife who died. And it says he did as he was commanded. He did not mourn for his wife. And that, of course, made a huge impression. The people asked, well, what does that mean? Why are you not mourning the death of your wife? And he explains to them what God tells him. The desire of the eyes of the captives, which is the temple in Jerusalem, would be profaned, and their sons and daughters that they left behind would be killed, and they would do as Ezekiel had done. They would not be able to mourn properly for that. Ezekiel was going to be mute, unable to speak, until one who escaped would come to tell them that the temple had been destroyed and their sons and daughters had been killed. And that did happen. He was mute until that time. And there's also prophecies against other nations mostly because of how they behaved regarding the destruction of Judah and the temple. Tyre and Egypt received most of the attention in those prophecies. And again, that a big part of the teaching in Ezekiel is that God did not want anyone to die. He wanted people to turn away from their sins and live. And in chapter 33, verse 30 through 33, that these people were not listening to Ezekiel, but he says, when these things will happen, they will know that a prophet has been among them. So God has Ezekiel prophesy against the shepherds of Israel, the leaders who only looked after themselves and not the flock, and he promises that he'll raise up David as a shepherd over them, and that's Jesus. That's a prophecy of Jesus. There's a few of those in the book. He prophesies against Edom some more. He promises to restore the land with his people. And he shows Ezekiel this vision of a valley with dry bones that God will bring to life, like he would bring the whole house of Israel back to life and set David as their prince forever. Again, a prophecy of Jesus. He has Ezekiel prophesy about Gog and Magog, where all these other nations come against the land of Israel, and then God destroys those who came against his people. And if any of this sounds familiar, but you're not sure you read it in Ezekiel, it's because it's extremely similar to what's in the book of Revelation. The chapters of the last chapters in the book, there are a vision in which God shows Ezekiel a new temple. And it's extremely detailed. I don't know why. I don't think it's a direct prophecy of the temple being rebuilt in Jerusalem, because it has water flowing from under the threshold of the temple toward the east, becoming a great river. That never happened literally when they rebuilt the temple. They didn't create a river. And it's the picture of righteousness coming out from it. And so I think it's a picture of the church, very similar to the glorified church at the end of Revelation, which is the temple of God, God being there with his people. But I don't know why there's so much detail. So somebody might help me with that, but that's something I've never really understood. But one of the things that he says is that in chapter 43, verses 10 through 12, he tells him to describe this temple to the house of Israel, that they may be ashamed of their iniquities and let them measure the pattern. And he has the laws of the temple, and he says they must keep the law. And so, he is telling them to do something with this information. But I don't know if that just means be careful to do according to the pattern of the law that God gives you wherever you are. But I'm not real sure. And in chapter 47, verse 21 through 23, he talks about them dividing the land. But he also talks about the foreigners, the strangers who live among them and bear children among them, being native born, like their native born among Israel, and that they will inherit with them. And that seems to be a prophecy of Gentiles being part of God's people in the church. And then the very last verse in Ezekiel 48, verse 35, it says, as he's described this temple in the city, the things around it, it says, all the way around shall be 18,000 cubits, and the name of the city from that day shall be, the Lord is there. And that seems to be the main focus, that this is describing God being with his people. But anyway, in this prophecy, Ezekiel is telling the Jews, he's talking to the Jews who've been taken captive after Daniel, but before the destruction of Jerusalem, although he prophesies through that time. And he acted out the siege on Jerusalem. He prophesied about it clearly before it happened. And God wanted the people to be ashamed of their sin and turn away in their hearts, not just turn away from these idols in their hearts, not just because they'd been taken away from them physically. The temple, which was their heart's desire, was destroyed so that they would seek God himself, and God would provide a new temple. They must be careful to perform everything in that new temple, and we must be careful to perform everything according to the law of Christ's temple. Whether that's the direct application of what he's saying or not, it's a lesson that we should get from it, that we are God's temple today, and we need to be very careful to do things according to his law. All right, but that's a summary of the book of Ezekiel, and I hope that was helpful to you. Thank you.